Thank you very much. And thank you to you all as well for taking the time to come and listen to me in this lightning talk today. One of the biggest opportunities and things I enjoy the most is actually the opportunity to come out and to share some of the ideas and the thoughts that have been generated through the research that we've been doing at Leeds Beckett University, and also in collaboration with other research teams, not only in the UK, but globally. So thank you to you. I want to start with a question, which is, what's your why? So what's your why in terms of what you do on a day-to-day basis, on a year-to-year basis, and why did you step foot into this room today? I think it's always helpful sometimes to get a sense of who the scientist is in front of you. So I'm going to give you a little bit about my why and what's brought me to research the area that I'm going to talk to you about today. And essentially my why is grounded in sport. My science is grounded in sport, and it's very much informed the decisions that I've taken throughout my childhood and then into my adult life as well. So it very much chose me in some ways. This is me as a young child, as we all do at Sports Day, and I guess this is where the passion and love of being physically active and doing sport came to bear. But sport and my competitive experiences essentially informed where I chose to go and study. It informed where I chose to go and live. It also informed the connections that I made and what I chose to do on evenings and weekends for many decades. It also now informs my current life as a wife and a mother to a 7-year-old energetic girl who loves to be active. And very much those experiences I had as a young person and the experiences that I hope we will have as a family, and many people, and there's younger people in the audience, will have for generations to come, very much is what motivates me and many members of my team to look at a greater understanding of what drives individuals to dope, but also what are the environmental factors that bring about those decisions to dope as well. And that's really very much about motivation, commitment and passion, because without sporting integrity, one is always led to question what we are actually observing and witnessing. So sport has a great ability to bring about moments of magnificence. You know, those feats of endeavour where people just look in awe at what sports people have achieved. This is very much a Yorkshire slide in that these individuals have connections to the university where I'm professor at Leeds Beckett. But as you can see in those moments, there's a huge elation, and as a spectator audience, you'll often have observed and witnessed those experiences yourself. The challenges come, though, when you start to question the underlying performances that you're seeing and you're witnessing. And that can then start to turn off audiences, turn off spectators. And in one research project we did, we actually heard one individual say that the sport that they participated in competitively is not a sport that they're going to encourage their child to engage in now in the future. So those are not situations that we want to encourage and that's where the protection of the integrity of sport is key. That's because sport can have a dark side to it, and allegations of doping are often weekly. And I'm just going to show you some screenshots of some stories that have just been posted on the BBC website in the last 8 weeks. So already just 6 postings of allegations of doping. And most recently, the identification of a pool of 298 athletes from the Russian laboratory following the analysis of those samples that have come from the investigations there. Those allegations, again, threaten that integrity of sport, and those allegations have been present for decades and for generations. But one thing that's often common around those stories and the way that those stories are told is that there is a dominant narrative, and that dominant narrative places blame on the individual athlete largely. And the blame is placed on the athlete largely because of the World Anti-Doping Code, that is the code that harmonises anti-doping rules and regulations across the globe. And as a very essence of that code is that it is the athlete's responsibility if a substance is found in their body, regardless of how it got there. That's this concept of strict liability. And with that, athletes are often then portrayed as individuals with a really competitive, vicious streak, with corrupt morals and ethics. And the doping as cheating narrative, in many ways, one could argue, has inhibited actions to address the issues, because those languages and images that often go alongside allegations of doping and describe the problem at hand can distort what we've found to be the issues and the behaviours, and also further stigmatise this issue. And stigma is a really big problem for us when it comes to taking action and gaining people's engagement in this problem more broadly. And I'll give you some examples of that. When we do research in this area and we engage with stakeholders and we ask questions about these issues at hand, we'll often find athletes or stakeholders might say to us, I don't want to take part in the research because that might suggest that I've got a problem in my sport, or being part of this might suggest there's a problem with me, rather than, I really want to engage in this because I want to change the way that we talk about these issues. There's a fear of engagement, not only in research, but also in education and any further intervention. And that's a challenge for us if we are going to protect the integrity of sport and prevent doping in the future. That problem is because, as I've just kind of highlighted, we have this situation of silence. So voices being silenced and behaviours being hidden. And often it's through trust in relationships between researchers and participants, and a trust that the stories will be told in a way that are meaningful and are honest and are truthful to those experiences, do we get some of the insight that we've been able to do as a scientific community over the last couple of decades. But I'd only say in the last few years have we really started to get under the skin of the complexity of this issue more broadly. And that's led to a real push to change the narrative that does accompany this issue more generally. We're arguing that we really need to start reframing the issue as one of a consequence of the environmental conditions and the opportunities that athletes and athlete support personnel find themselves in. And it's not just the result of poor personal choice. If we keep focusing on just fix the athletes, fix the bad apples, then this problem will go away. We've kind of been doing that for a few decades and it's not changed. So we have to change the way that we think about things and the way that we act in that regard. And we've called for a greater recognition around athlete vulnerability, because there are situations and contexts where athletes have a diminished capacity potentially to resist some of the pressures that they may be placed under, or some of the behaviours that they may not even be aware of in relation to their own bodies and their own spaces. And I'd like to illustrate this with a real life example that has really shocked the world in the way this story has been told, and I guess has brought to life this element of culpability beyond the individual athlete themselves. So I'm going to show a picture here of Heidi Krieger, if you can see that. So Heidi Krieger is a shot putter. Hands up if you've heard of the story of Heidi Krieger. Okay, so one person in the audience has been made aware of this. So Heidi Krieger was a female shot putter for East Germany around the era of the Cold War. And she is now Andreas Krieger. So the man that you can see to the left of that shot is Heidi now as Andreas Krieger. Because ultimately, Heidi at the time was fed steroids by state officials without her consent or knowledge. And as a consequence of that, has undergone surgery in order to now live life as a male. I'd like to share then the quote from Andrea's wife, Uta Klaus, who was also part of that system at the time. She said it was a dictatorship. Don't forget that they had a grip on youngsters. I was just 11, turning up at the sports club after school, and this is where it started. The coach would give us pills at the pool after training. We were told they were vitamins and that we needed them because we trained so hard. We were there to take them without any questions, assured that it was for our own good. One might think, well, yeah, that was in the 80s, that thing doesn't happen nowadays, that we've not got to worry about that level of influence and culpability. And not in the way of providing substances without consent, but in our own research within the UK, we did find instances where coaches, in this instance, talking about a topic of human growth hormone, which is an enhancer in terms of performance and recovery in particular. This strength and conditioning coach said to the player, and this is in the sport of rugby league, you can't really get caught for it, and you might get an extra £40,000 a year just by taking it, so I don't see why you wouldn't. So the influence of support personnel and the conversations and language and stories that are told is still a factor now today, and it's a factor within the UK. Now for that individual, they storied about going home and speaking to parents about this and what should I do? And actually at that point, there was two stories to this, the father and the mother. And they differed in their opinions. And one was saying, well, if everyone's doing it and you can't get caught for doing it, well, I don't know why you wouldn't. And then the other side of things, well, no. Could you really look at yourself and know that you've achieved that without the use of prohibited substances? And it was those conversations then that start to happen and that social network around an athlete that's really important. And it's also important to recognise that there are vulnerability moments where actually that conversation could have tipped an individual into using a prohibited substance. And those examples that we found and others have found in research, both in the UK and overseas, is that these are some of those vulnerability points when an individual who's just told you can't detect it, you might get an extra £40,000, why wouldn't you? There's a social influence in there. There are things like dips in performance or contracts and funding under threat. For many athletes, their income is what pays mortgages, it's what keeps them afloat essentially on a month-to-month basis. If there are concerns around team selection, that could be a vulnerability point as well. And going through a transition, we have heard, and through our research, instances where athletes may dope until a certain point in time, and then when they think they may be then subject to more frequent drug testing, they will stop at that point, but will still have gained some of the benefits from that doping behaviour long into the future. The science and the evidence is there for the muscle memory changes that can occur. Entering a new training environment, and one where we should be really concerned is the gym environment, particularly now with current increases in the use of substances such as anabolic steroids and other body modification enhancement drugs. That can be a tipping point because, again, you see a normalisation of some of those uses within those environments. Dealing with injury or excessive workload, is sport too demanding to actually be able to achieve some of those feats without the use of prohibited substances? Do we give sufficient recovery to our athletes in order to avoid the need for some of these substances? And this perception that everyone is doping and getting away with it, whether that's perception or fact, that can be equally important. But we find on average, people estimate around 22% of athletes to be doping. And that's consistent across quite a number of studies that we've conducted. So what we are really emphasising, and the research is really starting to move forward, to recognise doping as a complex social problem, not just an individual personal choice. It's stubborn, it's long-term, it's persistent. There are multiple explanations for causes of the problem. There's multiple stakeholders who interact and causes that interact and influence each other. And there are competing and conflicting interests in the world of sport that can provide fertile ground for this behaviour to take place. And critically, there's no single solution that's going to stop doping from occurring. Even though I'm often asked that question, well, what's the one thing that we can do? There's no single solution. That's led us to bring about a new phrase, which is a dopagenic environment. That is to try and move us away from that individual responsibility, individual accountability, and recognise that we have environments that promote doping. And I've just got some images there to show you on the screen of some of those environments. You only now need to go in your petrol station and you can pick up every type of supplement that you wish to engage with. Now, for many, you don't need those supplements. And for others, there potentially are risks to some of those supplements in terms of containing prohibited substances if you're an athlete subject to testing. So there's risks of inadvertent doping in our environments. The mindset around a win-at-all-cost mentality. The ease and ability to obtain some of those substances, next day delivery from the comfort of your own home through the internet. The challenge is, do you really know what you're consuming through those purchases? The networks that we're now within and subject to, and also then that kind of community and culture of silence is a challenge. So the question is, are athletes born to dope? There's no evidence that we have at the moment scientifically that there is a genetic disposition to dope or that we are born to dope. But there's increasing evidence now that we are in social and physical environments that are facilitating and enabling doping. So the final points that I just want to raise with you is this statement of if you change nothing, nothing will change. That's a really important part for us in this behaviour and trying to address the issue of doping in sport and protecting the integrity of sport. So to bring back to those points that I've made in this talk, it's really important to make time for a new doping narrative beyond that cheating athlete. We have to take action on the dopagenic environment. Those are the things that constantly are in our environment that might lead to those changes. And protecting sport's everyone's business. It's not just one individual's responsibility, one sport, one country. There's a whole lot of collective action that needs to take place if we are to do what I'm committed to, which is protecting that integrity of sport. So thank you for your time.
Got time for a couple of questions if anyone would like to. If you raise your hand, I'll come to a microphone.
I guess there is a thin line between what's legal and what's not legal. So how do we decide what we allow and what not?
So that question around the grey zone is probably one of the most talked about issues at the moment, particularly with the situations around therapeutic use exemptions and some of the medications that athletes may take. The simple fact of it at the moment is we have a prohibited list which outlines those substances that athletes are able and permitted to take. That essentially is the line. I think the challenge at the moment is where perhaps some of the social influences and some of the environmental pressures may be pushed beyond that line and maybe lead to behaviours that are not perhaps fair to that line as they need to be. So if I take the system of a therapeutic use exemption, athletes should be able to use substances that are prohibited because that's their medical right. We have to protect health and well-being of athletes as well as their performance. But if doctors, for example, are prescribing substances that they know are on the list and they're not medically needed, that's where we have those challenges. And I think that's when we start to tip into grey zones, well, not even grey zones, poor medical ethics and all those kind of things. So I think that grey zone then comes around that complexity that we're talking about.
You talk about protecting the integrity of sports, and you're thinking of protecting it. And do you have any suggestions of how to reduce the level of doping?
If you look at some of the most recent cases that have been pretty significant in size and scale, those cases have really come about because people have spoken up about wrongdoing. People have come forward with information that they're aware of. And the word whistleblowing is used. That's not a great phrase because that's another stigmatizing language, but it is people who have come forward with information because they're part of that system. Similarly, in terms of, we talked about Andreas Krieger, Heidi Krieger, that was again whistleblowers around that system. That, for me, is one of the most significant opportunities for bringing about change, because oftentimes people know what's happening, but they're not either able to speak up about it or unable to speak up about it. And I think that's the future, and that's where we're seeing far more evidence bases coming forward that allow us to take more significant action.
It doesn't seem as though the financial incentives to cheat are going away on the draw, the pull side of that. Is there anything other than just strict enforcement and better criminal enforcement of it to change that?
Yeah, I think arguably one of the biggest failures of this as a system at the moment is it's been all focused around enforcement and detection deterrence. The greater opportunity is actually to change some of those system elements. So if you think about the financial incentives, some of those are also because it's incredibly precarious working conditions. So athletes may find themselves on year-to-year contracts without any long-term sustainability to that. So that is really where we need to start to change, is actually the whole system of how sport is managed, is organised, is promoted. Because while there is those essentially the carrots, as we say, not only for the athlete, but the system around the athlete. Because for coaches, that could be the the reason their contract gets extended, for other support personnel around that. That's potentially what we've got there. So we have to start looking at how we organise and manage sport. And that's a slightly bigger issue than just let's test more athletes and try and detect some substances in their system. Thank you. Thanks for listening.